Hey guys. Tonight, we begin with the strange world of fake history. Every American child learns in school the kind of comforting stories that smooth out the rough edges of the past, turn complicated people into cartoon heroes, and quietly leave out the parts that make grown-ups sweat during parent-teacher night. You sit there as a kid, wide-eyed, believing every overly polished tale, completely unaware that entire chapters have been trimmed, softened, or quietly reshuffled, like a magician distracting the audience with glitter. And now, as you look back, you start to feel that tug of curiosity, wondering what was real, what was stretched, and what was slipped in just to keep a classroom quiet for 20 minutes. So, before you get too cozy, take a second to gently tap that new hype button YouTube just added. It really does help little guys like me push through the algorithm. And be sure to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy this strange little corner of quiet storytelling. Drop a comment with where you're listening from and what time it is for you. It's strangely comforting to know who else is drifting off with us around the world. Now, get comfortable, let the day melt away, and we'll drift back together into the quiet corners of the past. You sit at the tiny desk again, the one with the wobble in the front left leg that thumps the floor every time you shift your weight. The plastic seat is far too bright, the overhead lights far too harsh, and the whole room smells faintly like crayons and the kind of hand soap that never quite rinses off. You are small, tired, and trying your best to understand why the world is apparently divided into tidy chapters that fit neatly between a lunch bell and a spelling test. Your teacher stands at the front, cheerful in that way adults get when they are trying to sell children a version of reality that has been sanitized like a cafeteria tray. You watch her gesture at a poster with smiling historical figures, each one frozen in heroic perfection, and you take it all in without question. Because that is what kids do. You repeat the stories back, line by line, because repetition is the currency of early education. The more you say something, the truer it becomes, even if it was trimmed, polished, or stitched together in ways no one bothered to explain. You do not notice the missing details or the awkward gaps. You do not wonder why some characters are presented as flawless, while others appear only long enough to say something inspiring and then disappear like they had somewhere more important to be. You simply trust the tone, the smiles, and the certainty of adults who speak as if the universe came packaged with instructions. As the years pass, you keep absorbing stories that have been compressed into gentle shapes. You see paintings of scenes that never happened, yet they feel real because they are printed on glossy pages that reflect the fluorescent lights just right. The illustrations show perfect weather, clean clothes, and characters who never seem bothered by the fact that history is supposed to be a tangled, inconvenient thing. You copy these pictures into your notes with colored pencils and feel proud when your drawings look almost as polished as the originals. Every now and then a question flickers at the edge of your mind. Maybe you wonder why everything seems so convenient, or why no one ever mentions the messy parts of these famous events. But the moment you raise your hand, the teacher smiles and assures you that the full story comes later, usually in a higher grade that feels impossibly far away. So you let it go and return to the tidy version, the one that fits neatly beside your multiplication tables. You grow older, but the stories stay in place, tucked into your mind like laminated flashcards. You remember them with the same unquestioned confidence you had when you believed cartoons were filmed in real time. The tales feel sturdy, like they must be grounded in solid fact, because how else could they survive the long parade of classrooms, teachers, and textbook editions? It never occurs to you that some details survived simply because they were charming, or easy to draw, or less likely to inspire uncomfortable questions right before recess. Only later, when you revisit these early memories, do you sense the gentle sleight of hand. You start noticing how the simple stories were not wrong so much as they were carefully curated for small minds with short attention spans. You feel the faint shift as if someone has quietly tugged the lens and revealed the edges of the stage you never knew was there. It is not betrayal that washes over you, but a kind of quiet astonishment at how easily a narrative becomes truth when it is delivered with enough confidence and a stapled workbook. And now, looking back, you see yourself seated at that tiny desk, legs swinging above the floor, believing every comforting line. You watch that version of you cling to the stories like they are anchor points in a world too big to understand, and you do not blame yourself. You simply recognize how powerful a simple story can be when it arrives early, brightly colored, and wrapped in the absolute certainty of a teacher's voice. You sit in the same classroom where the flag hangs slightly crooked, swaying whenever the air conditioner coughs to life. You do not question the stories, because they arrive with an air of ceremonial importance, delivered between the pledge and a worksheet on long division. Your teacher tells them with a warm certainty that makes you feel as if the entire country has been crafted out of pure determination and good manners. You listen as brave figures stride across the timeline, leaving behind shimmering footsteps that no one bothers to examine too closely. Their heroism feels spotless, like someone scrubbed the past with industrial strength optimism before handing it to children who still believe. Glue sticks are a viable food source if things get desperate enough. Every tale follows the same pattern. There is a courageous moment, a noble decision, and a sense that everything works out through sheer patriotic virtue, as if the nation runs on inspirational speeches and well-meaning smiles. You do not notice how each story has been gently buffed until it gleams. The conflicts are smoothed over like dents on a used car that is being sold at full price. Historical figures speak in perfect quotes that sound suspiciously rehearsed, and any questionable choices are either dramatically softened or whisked away entirely, much like the class hamster after its brief but memorable escape attempt. You find yourself feeling proud in that uncomplicated childhood way, the kind that swells when a teacher tells you your nation was built by heroic people who always did the right thing, often while illuminated by some unseen heavenly spotlight. You imagine them doing everything with flawless posture, stopping only to sign important documents with pens that probably sparkled. The stories are designed to be digestible, pleasant, and fit for a classroom where half the students are still recovering from the emotional devastation of losing their favorite crayon. What you do not see is the invisible editing committee hovering behind each tale. They trim the rough edges, rearrange events, and sand down the morally questionable bits until they resemble something closer to a bedtime story than a historical record. They leave in the triumphs, the victories, the stirring speeches, and the kind of heroics that land well in school assemblies. They leave out the chaos, the contradictions, and the messy decisions that would require explanations far longer than the school day allows. You are handed the simplified version not out of malice, but out of a desire to keep the room calm, focused, and reasonably patriotic. Years later, when you revisit these stories, you start to see the glossy shine for what it is. You realize the past was not a parade of perfect choices, but a tangled series of human decisions that occasionally lined up in inspiring ways. You feel that subtle shift as the myths gently peel away, revealing events that are far more complicated and far more interesting than the versions you memorized for tests. There is something oddly comforting about discovering that history is not a flawless mural, but a patchwork of contradictions and imperfect people doing their best, or at least something close to it. And now, looking back, you understand why those polished tales existed. They were meant to steady young minds, to offer a sense of direction in rooms where chaos lived only one rainy indoor recess away. They were crafted to inspire you, not bewilder you, and for a time they did exactly that. You remember sitting in class as your teacher flips to a glossy textbook page showing a single heroic inventor staring boldly into the distance, usually with wind-swept hair that suggests innovation comes with its own weather system. The caption announces that this person, and this person alone, single-handedly changed the course of human history using nothing more than genius, determination, and possibly a well-timed lightning bolt. You look at the picture in awe, convinced that world-changing ideas emerge fully formed in one dramatic moment, usually accompanied by triumphant music only you can hear. No one mentions the team in the background. The assistants elbow deep in gears, wires, and mild frustration, each one contributing something essential while receiving the kind of credit usually reserved for a footnote at the bottom of the page. You memorize the names like they are passwords to adulthood, believing that invention is a solo sport and brilliance travels in straight lines. Each chapter introduces another lone genius, saving the world, while conveniently ignoring the rivals who worked on the person. Same ideas, often at the same time, sometimes better, sometimes worse, and occasionally faster. You never hear about the one who almost got there first, but paused for a snack break that would haunt them for the rest of their career. The textbook is not interested in near misses or shared victories. It prefers the cleaner version, the one where humanity advances in neat leaps, each one credited to a single chosen icon whose portrait looks suspiciously airbrushed. As you grow older, you start to notice the cracks. There are whispers in documentaries, stray lines in articles, and the occasional museum plaque that casually mentions an entire team left out of the spotlight. You begin to realize that the great inventor you spent childhood admiring did not work alone in a glowing laboratory filled with dramatic shadows. They worked with others, argued with others, borrowed from others, and sometimes outright snatched ideas so quickly that historians still cannot untangle who did what. You also learn that rivals were not comic book villains lurking in the background waiting to be defeated. They were equally driven, sometimes equally brilliant, and often equally ignored when the storytelling spotlight chose a favorite. The more you uncover, the stranger your memories feel. You think back to the simplified diagrams in your old textbooks, where one smiling inventor stands beside a shining invention as if it appeared overnight. You remember the class assignments where you drew a single famous figure holding a prototype that had actually been touched by dozens of hands. You remember feeling inspired, then slightly confused, then strangely betrayed when you learn the truth. But the feeling passes quickly because you also understand why the stories were told that way. It is easier to inspire children with a single face than with a crowded group photo where everyone looks vaguely unsure about where to stand. Now, when you picture invention, you see a cluttered room filled with people whose names will never appear in textbooks, each one arguing, tinkering, scribbling, and occasionally questioning their life choices. You picture the forgotten contributors whose ideas shaped the final product, the rivals racing toward the same goal, and the quiet collaborators who spent long hours solving the problems no one else wanted to handle. You see the whole ecosystem instead of the single spotlight. It does not make the inventors less impressive. It simply makes the story more human, and somehow that makes the invention itself feel even larger. You remember being told that explorers were the bravest people imaginable, the ones who tightened their boots, pointed at an empty stretch of map, and announced they would fill it before dinner. Your textbook showed them standing proudly at the bow of a ship or on top of a cliff, hair flowing like they had their own personal breeze machine. They were always gazing confidently toward the horizon, as if uncertainty never crossed. Their mind and seasickness was merely a rumor invented by less impressive mortals. You accepted these portraits without question because the stories were designed that way, polished into something sturdy enough for children who still struggled to sit still through read-aloud time. You grew up believing these explorers were flawless pioneers, people who knew exactly what they were doing at every moment. Their journeys sounded like exciting treasure hunts, full of daring decisions and triumphant discoveries, the kind of adventures that made you wonder why you could not even navigate the school hallways without a laminated pass. The textbook never lingered on their mistakes or their terrors or the days they wandered in circles wishing someone else had packed the map. Instead, it painted their lives in confident brushstrokes, as if each explorer marched through danger with perfect posture and an inspiring soundtrack. Only later do you begin noticing the gaps. You hear a stray comment from a documentary narrator, or read a sentence in a book that refuses to celebrate so easily. You learn that many explorers were not just adventurers, but also flawed, conflicted, sometimes deeply troubled individuals who made decisions that would never fit neatly on a classroom poster. Their motivations were not always pure bravery or noble curiosity. Sometimes they were fueled by ambition, desperation, greed, or the simple desire to avoid dealing with the people they owed money to. The heroic archetype starts to wobble a little as you realize how many inconvenient truths were quietly pushed aside like clutter before company arrives. You think back to the classroom maps with their bright lines tracing routes across oceans and continents. As a child, you imagined those lines as smooth, purposeful paths marked by confidence and clarity. Now you realize they were more like chaotic scribbles, the result of storms, miscalculations, illnesses, arguments, and the general chaos of navigating a world without GPS. You begin to sense the emotional weather underneath the polished tales, the fear, the uncertainty, the conflicts among crews who definitely did not speak in calm, inspirational monologues. The stories feel different now, not worse, not better, just more real. You see the explorers as complicated people instead of heroic silhouettes. You picture them pacing decks at night, second-guessing themselves, making choices that ripple through history in ways they never intended. You imagine the moments where they wondered if they had gone too far, or not far enough, or if they should have listened when someone begged them to turn the ship around. You understand that they were not cardboard champions, but human beings stumbling through unknown worlds with limited knowledge and questionable judgment. And yet something in that complexity feels strangely comforting. It strips away the myth, but replaces it with something deeper, something that acknowledges the messy truth behind, the clean lines of your childhood lessons. You no longer see explorers as flawless pioneers. You see them as deeply human figures, navigating landscapes that challenge them in every possible way, and somehow that makes their journeys feel more significant than the polished versions ever did. You notice it first in a moment so small it barely registers. A teacher pauses before explaining a chapter, glances at the room full of restless kids who have already eaten too much paste-flavored air, and decides to shorten the story. You do not realize it at the time, but something has just been trimmed. A detail, a complication, a person who did something inconvenient. The class will never hear that part because the clock is ticking, attention spans are shrinking, and no one wants to field questions that could spiral into chaos before lunch. You sit there absorbing the simplified version, convinced it is the whole truth simply because it arrives neatly packaged and spoken with confidence. Years later, you start piecing together the pattern. The heroic narratives you learned were not simplified by accident, but by design. Adults wanted classroom stories to feel clear, inspiring, and manageable, especially for students who still struggled to tie their shoes without turning the laces into a psychological puzzle. Complexity was a luxury reserved for older students, or sometimes not offered at all, depending on how many uncomfortable discussions a school district was willing to entertain. You begin to understand why the tales felt so clean. Messiness creates questions. Questions lead to raised hands, and raised hands derail entire lesson plans. You think back to those early stories, the ones filled with certainty. Heroes acted with unwavering conviction. Villains were conveniently labeled. Events flowed smoothly from cause to effect, like history itself had been organized by someone with a fondness for alphabetical order. Teachers were not trying to deceive you. They were trying to survive the impossible task of summarizing centuries for children who could be distracted by a passing dust mote. They needed stories that could be taught in one sitting, stories that left everyone feeling reasonably upbeat and ready to move on to math. But real history does not behave that way. It sprawls. It contradicts itself. It produces people who are heroic in one chapter and disastrous in another. Once you begin reading the fuller versions, you see how many of these narrative edits were made for convenience rather than clarity. Heroes were streamlined so younger students would not drown in moral ambiguity before recess. Rough decisions were softened so parents would not send concerned emails. Entire events were rearranged like furniture to prevent anyone from tripping over the more problematic truths. You remember sitting in those tiny chairs, legs dangling, listening to stories that felt comforting in their simplicity. You never wondered why every hero seemed to wake up, knowing exactly what to do, or why every challenge resolved just in time for the next quiz. You did not notice the missing parts because you had never been given the chance to. Only now do you see the invisible scaffolding, the narrative supports holding everything upright so it would not collapse under the weight of its own complexity. What surprises you most is how understandable the impulse is. Adults wanted you to feel proud, steady, certain of your place in a story that seemed to move with purpose. They wanted to shield you from the chaotic truth until you were older, or until they felt brave enough to peel back the layers. And for a while, the streamlined stories worked, giving you anchors in a world that felt too large to understand. But now that you are older, the polished versions no longer feel complete. You reach for the fuller stories, the ones with contradictions and flaws, and you realize that complexity does not diminish the past. It makes it real. It makes it human. It makes the story wide enough to hold everything that was left out the first time. You remember sitting at your desk while your teacher introduced a historical conflict with a calm smile, the kind that suggests nothing particularly troubling is about to happen. The map on the wall shows bright colors divided into friendly shapes, almost like a board game everyone agreed to play politely. You are told the conflict began for simple reasons and ended for even simpler ones, usually with a handshake, a treaty, or a heroic moment that feels suspiciously like a movie scene. You nod along, believing that history unfolds in tidy arcs where problems rise, peak, and gently settle like well-behaved waves. No one mentions the chaos lurking underneath, because chaos is hard to color inside the lines of a worksheet. The stories glide smoothly from tension to resolution, skipping over the discomfort of real human decisions. You learn about disagreements that sound almost charming, like neighbors arguing over fence height rather than nations colliding with all the subtlety of a stampede. The messy motives are scrubbed away, replaced with single-sentence explanations designed to fit neatly on a test. Entire groups vanish or appear only long enough to deliver a quotable line before fading back into the margins. Conflicts shrink into narratives, small enough to fit between announcements about Library Day and a reminder not to put erasers up your nose. As you grow older, you start noticing the strange softness of those early stories. You stumble across details that refuse to fit the cheerful arcs you memorized. Suddenly, the conflicts do not look like simple disagreements. They look like complicated knots made of fear, ambition, desperation, misunderstanding, and the kind of political decision-making that would give any adult a permanent headache. You see leaders who wavered, factions that fractured, and ordinary people swept up in events they neither caused nor controlled. None of this made it into your elementary school lessons because it would have shattered the calm atmosphere faster than a fire drill. You revisit those childhood textbooks and notice how the illustrations always showed participants standing at respectable distances, often maintaining improbably good posture for people involved in tense situations. The scenes were composed like polite theater performances. No panic, no confusion, no messy consequences spilling into the next generation. Just a conflict introduced, escalated, and resolved with all the emotional complexity of a school play. You realize now that the stories were flattened not to mislead you, but to protect you from a world that felt too heavy to place on small shoulders. But once the fuller truth appears, it will not shrink back. You see how many conflicts were rewritten to avoid moral ambiguity, how many events were reframed to present clear heroes and obvious conclusions. You begin to understand the parts that were softened, like the uncomfortable alliances, the miscommunications, the simmering tensions that brewed for years before anyone lit the fuse. You see the aftermaths that stretched far beyond the final chapter, lingering in ways your childhood lessons never hinted at. And strangely, the real stories feel more honest, even with their complications. You stop expecting history to behave like a well-structured plot. You accept that conflicts are messy things, filled with people making decisions under pressure, guided by hopes, fears, and the occasional disastrous impulse. The classroom-friendly versions gave you a scaffold, but now you replace it with the truth, which is jagged at times but undeniably alive. You remember the first time your teacher flipped open the history book to the chapter on ancient civilizations. The page exploded with bright colors, smiling figures, and buildings that looked suspiciously cleaner than anything that had ever existed in the real world. Every culture was reduced to a cheerful snapshot, the kind you might find in a travel brochure written by someone who had never actually visited the place. You stared at pyramids that gleamed like polished toys and statues that stood so proudly they seemed immune to gravity, weather, or human error. The illustrations made it look as though ancient people spent their time striking heroic poses and inventing things purely for future classroom entertainment. You learned entire cultures through a handful of catchy lines designed to be memorized before recess. Egyptians built big triangles. Greeks liked thinking. Romans built roads. Mayans had calendars. Mesopotamians made other things that sounded important but disappeared from your mind the instant the lunch bell rang. Each summary felt like a label slapped onto a museum display, simple and tidy enough for small brains powered by juice boxes and questionable cafeteria nuggets. You trusted these summaries without hesitation because they arrived with confidence and a surprising number of exclamation points. Only later do you realize that entire civilizations were flattened into cartoon versions of themselves. Real ancient people with real lives and real emotions were replaced by mascot-like characters holding symbolic objects while smiling with unsettling enthusiasm. You were told about their inventions but not their arguments, their architecture but not their disagreements, their achievements but almost none of their frustrations. The complexities of religion, politics, trade, language, conflict, and daily life were squeezed into single paragraphs that felt more like fortune cookie messages than actual history. You never questioned why every ancient figure seemed to have perfect posture or why they all looked suspiciously unbothered by the lack of modern plumbing. When you revisit these cultures as an adult, the contrast hits you like cold water. Suddenly, the ancient world is not tidy at all. It is busy, crowded, ingenious, flawed, beautiful, terrifying, ordinary, and extraordinary all at once. You learn that ideas developed slowly, sometimes over centuries, through trial, error, and the collective work of countless unnamed people. You discover that civilizations rose and fell in complicated patterns, shaped by geography, climate, politics, alliances, rivalries, and the human habit of occasionally making disastrous decisions. None of this made it into your childhood lessons because the full version would have required a semester, several diagrams, and a class of students who were not attempting to eat glue. You start noticing how the illustrations in your memory feel almost ridiculous now. Ancient cities drawn as tidy clusters of buildings with zero trash, zero noise, and zero smell. Warriors who look like they just stepped out of a costume store. Farmers who seem suspiciously happy about farming. The ancient world was packaged like a theme park to make it easier to digest, easier to test, and easier to discuss without spiraling into existential dread. And yet there is something endearing about the attempt. Adults were trying to introduce you to vast civilizations using tools simple enough for a child still learning how to hold a pencil correctly. They needed bright colors and memorable phrases, even if the trade-off was a version of history that resembled a cheerful postcard more than a real society. You understand now that the complexity was never gone. It was just waiting for you to be ready to see it. You remember the way your teacher introduced the early settlers, as if they were plucky characters from a children's adventure book, the kind who pack a single trunk, wave bravely at the horizon, and step into history with the confidence of people who have never had to assemble furniture without instructions. The illustrations in your textbook showed them smiling in spotless clothing, hands on hips, gazing proudly at forests that looked conveniently non-threatening. You were told they arrived, seeking opportunity, freedom, and maybe a little excitement. as if the entire journey were a carefully supervised field trip. You accepted these stories easily because they came with bright pictures, tidy captions, and the reassuring tone of an adult who wanted everyone to stay calm until lunchtime. It never crossed your mind that the landing scenes were missing a few important details. The winters did not look cold enough. The shelters looked like they had been assembled by people who somehow knew how to build perfect roofs on the first try. No one ever appeared hungry or scared or questioning their life choices. You never saw the confusion, the clashing expectations, the fear of being hopelessly unprepared for a landscape that did not care how optimistic you felt. The textbook settlers seemed unreasonably good at everything, which was impressive considering they barely brought anything besides hope and some wooden spoons. Later, when you start reading the larger, messier versions of events, the tidy classroom myth cracks open. You learn that early settlements were less inspiring triumph over adversity, and more a series of increasingly questionable decisions made by people who realized too late they should have packed differently. You find accounts describing disorganization, mistakes, infighting, illnesses, and long stretches where no one had any idea what they were doing. You discover that relationships between settlers and the people already living on the land were not simple or polite or confined to one predictable storyline. The past suddenly feels much heavier than the cheerful scenes you colored with crayons. You think back to those childhood lessons and understand why the complicated parts were quietly pushed aside. Teachers needed stories that could be delivered without sparking 1,000 questions about fairness, survival, conflict, and what actually happens when unprepared people arrive somewhere they do not fully understand. They needed narratives that kept the room peaceful, ones that prevented someone from raising their hand and asking the kind of questions no elementary teacher wants to field before a fire drill. So the darker threads were tucked away, replaced with stories of cooperative meals, brave perseverance, and improbable harmony. Yet the truth feels more human once you finally see it. Settlers were not flawless pioneers marching into destiny. They were people trying to survive, often failing, sometimes learning, sometimes not. They made choices shaped by fear, ambition, misunderstanding, and necessity. They stumbled through challenges their textbooks never mentioned, struggled with consequences you never heard about, and lived lives far too complicated to fit in the cheerful scenes from your childhood lessons. And when you look back on the simplified version, you can almost understand why it was presented that way. Children need handholds, not whole tangled histories. The myths were meant to guide you, not to deceive you, even though they left out more truth than they included. Now, with wider eyes and a fuller understanding, you see the early settlers not as icons, but as humans walking into the unknown, carrying far more uncertainty than your childhood lessons ever allowed you to imagine. You sit in your childhood classroom again, the one where the chairs were so small they felt like props from a dollhouse, and the walls were covered in posters declaring that history was essentially a parade of important people doing important things, while everyone else apparently stood quietly to the side holding snacks. Your textbook opens with a heroic portrait, usually of someone wearing a dramatic coat, staring into the distance like they are waiting for destiny to arrive on horseback. The caption announces their greatness with the confidence of someone narrating a movie trailer, and you absorb every word because that is what you were trained to do. These were the names to memorize, the faces, to recognize the figures who mattered. Everyone else, according to the book, lived in soft focus on the edges of the page, blending into the background like extras who wandered onto set by accident. The stories flowed the same way each time. A great leader makes a great decision, leading to a great result that conveniently fits into a few short paragraphs. You never hear about the farmers, the workers, the people carrying water, building tools, fixing disasters, or wishing someone else would take a turn making history for once. If they appear at all, they appear as an anonymous crowd cheering politely, as though their entire existence was to applaud at appropriate moments. Your teacher never stops to explain what daily life felt like for them, how they argued, worked, celebrated, struggled, or survived. They are simply not the point. As a kid, you do not question this. The great characters are easier to follow. They have names, faces, birthdays, and quotes that fit conveniently on worksheets. They speak with certainty and do not require you to imagine the complicated swirl of ordinary lives underneath. It is easier than trying to grasp the experiences of thousands of people who did not live tidy, plot-friendly lives. You accept the structure because the structure is designed to be accepted. Everyone else fades into the background like scenery. But later, when you revisit these stories with older eyes, the absence starts to feel strangely loud. You begin noticing all the silhouettes that once stood behind the heroes, the countless unnamed people whose choices, sweat, stubbornness, and disasters shaped the world just as much as the figures who received all the credit. You read a line about a monumental event and suddenly wonder who lit the fires, who repaired the ships, who cooked the food, who carried the letters, who whispered doubts, who pushed back, who got overlooked. You picture entire populations working and hoping and struggling, all while your textbook gave them a single sentence framed as a supporting detail. You start imagining the mundane chaos that must have surrounded these grand moments. The general giving orders probably had a soldier nearby who was hungry, exhausted, and wondering why no one had brought spare socks. The famous inventor presenting a breakthrough likely had a team behind him debating whether the invention was brilliant or simply a fire hazard with ambition. The celebrated leader signing a treaty definitely had assistants scrambling to organize papers while worrying that someone would spill ink at the worst possible moment. None of these people appear in the childhood version, yet they are the ones who held the whole messy structure together. The more you learn, the more surreal the old narratives feel. History is presented as if every great achievement burst forth from a single mind, as if societal progress was the result of isolated brilliance rather than countless invisible hands, pushing, pulling, building, and sometimes tripping over one another. You realize how many of the ordinary people were edited out, not because they were unimportant, but because their presence complicated the clean lines of a story meant to fit into a chapter review. Their lives were too detailed, too real, too human to condense into a neat paragraph sandwiched between two famous quotes. And yet, once you notice their absence, you cannot unsee it. The background becomes the real story, humming with people who will never have their faces printed in textbooks. People who shaped events quietly, without statues, portraits, or classroom posters. People who lived through the consequences of decisions made by leaders they never met. People who carried history on their backs long before anyone bothered to write it down. You finally understand that greatness is not a solo performance. It is a crowded, chaotic collaboration in which countless ordinary lives matter far more than the heroic spotlight ever allowed you to believe. You picture a long conference table in a windowless room, the kind of place where fluorescent lights hum like nervous insects and the air feels slightly too cold for comfort. You imagine a handful of adults sitting there with stacks of drafts, red pens, and mugs of lukewarm coffee that has surrendered all hope. These are the people who quietly decided what you learned as a child, not the heroic figures in your textbook, not the iconic names etched into marble, but a committee of tired humans who spent hours debating whether a paragraph was too complicated for fourth graders or whether an illustration should have more smiling faces to keep parents from calling the school. You did not know they existed back then. Their fingerprints were everywhere, yet you never saw them. You remember opening your history book and assuming every sentence had descended from some ultimate vault of truth. It never crossed your mind that those sentences had been discussed, rearranged, softened, or trimmed by a group of people you would never meet. You had no idea that entire chapters were shaped by disagreements over tone, vocabulary, budget, and the lingering fear that a school district somewhere would object to a single uncomfortable adjective. The stories felt timeless, but many had been edited late at night by someone rubbing their temples, wondering whether 9-year-olds could handle one more nuance without writing dramatic comments in the margins. As you grow older, the existence of textbook committees starts to feel bizarre. These groups were not historians in dusty libraries or scholars deciphering ancient texts. They were teams of editors, reviewers, consultants, and sometimes individuals who had not opened a history book since their own school days. They worked within guidelines, deadlines, and the constant pressure to keep lessons upbeat, manageable, and aligned with whatever standards happened to be in fashion that decade. The committee had to transform centuries of human chaos into chapters short enough to survive a school day where at least one student was always on the verge of a dramatic meltdown. You begin to realize how much power they held, shaping the way millions of children would picture the past. A single decision in that room determined whether a story felt heroic or troubling, whether a figure appeared wise or questionable, whether a conflict was explained in one sentence or given an entire page. The committee was responsible for choosing which voices appeared and which vanished between drafts, which events were emphasized and which were quietly nudged into the footnotes. You start understanding how entire generations grew up sharing the same polished myths simply because a committee believed those myths were easier to teach. You imagine the debates that must have unfolded. One person arguing that a chapter needed more context, another insisting that children would get confused, another worrying about upsetting parents, and someone in the back just wanting to finish before the parking lot filled with rush hour traffic. You imagine how many complexities were cut for space, how many difficult truths were set aside so no teacher would have to explain them to a class still struggling to understand the difference between fact and personal opinion. When you revisit your old textbooks, you see the committee's presence everywhere, in the tidy language, in the shortened timelines, in the cheerful illustrations that smooth over every jagged edge. They were not trying to deceive you so much as they were trying to create a version of history that would hold together long enough for kids to pass a quiz and teachers to survive another week. And now, knowing this, you feel a strange mix of amusement and clarity. History was never a single voice speaking from the past. It was a chorus, edited by a committee armed with coffee and caution, shaping what you believed long before you knew the world was too complicated to fit on glossy paper. You remember the first time you saw their portraits lined up in a perfect little row, each face glowing with the serene confidence of someone who apparently never spilled ink, lost their temper, or made a decision they immediately questioned. Your teacher spoke their names with a kind of reverence usually reserved for saints or cartoon characters who always know the right thing to say. You learned that these founding figures were brilliant, steady, noble, and remarkably free of the human flaws the rest of the world seems to collect like gum wrappers. Every line in your textbook insisted that they strode through history with sure footing, guided by clarity, courage, and the kind of unwavering certainty no real person has ever managed to maintain for more than 3 minutes. You grew up believing that these men sat down together, exchanged wise nods, and calmly shaped a nation without raising their voices or questioning whether they were doing the right thing. Their debates were portrayed like polite tea meetings rather than the heated, anxious, occasionally chaotic arguments they truly were. Any hint of doubt, hesitation, or confusion was carefully trimmed away until each founder looked like he woke up every morning fully aware he was destined to land on currency. Nothing in your lessons suggested they were unsure, overwhelmed, exhausted, or desperately trying to navigate a world filled with conflicting interests and unpredictable dangers. When you return to their stories as an adult, you begin noticing the strange stillness in those childhood versions. You notice how every uncertain pause has been smoothed over, how disagreements were rewritten into friendly conversations, how mistakes vanished into the margins, like someone had quietly swept them away before company arrived. You find letters filled with frustration, journals marked by hesitation, and speeches that sound nothing like the polished quotes your textbook claimed they said with absolute confidence. The founders you thought you knew were far more complex than the tidy legends that sat on your desk in laminated form. It feels almost disorienting at first. You discover men who argued fiercely, who doubted themselves, who worried they were building something that could collapse before it even began. You see them wrestling with questions that had no clear answers, trying to balance ideals with reality, and stumbling through decisions that would shape generations despite having no guidebook or certainty they were doing it correctly. Their brilliance becomes more impressive, not less, once you realize how often they operated in the dark. You think back to the childhood lessons that left out every crack in the story. The simplification makes sense now. Teachers needed figures who could serve as anchors in a storm of information, steady silhouettes to help children feel grounded. Complexity was not the goal. Inspiration was. The idea of perfect founders made the past feel safe and orderly, even when the truth was anything but. But now you see that the real people behind the legends were far from perfect, and that is what makes their accomplishments so astonishing. Their uncertainties were not signs of weakness, they were signs of humanity, proof that the world is often shaped by people doing their best while carrying doubt on their shoulders. The myth of perfection fades, replaced by something richer and far more real, and you realize that the story never needed to be flawless for it to matter. You remember the first time your teacher wrote one of those famous Liberty quotes on the board, the chalk squeaking in a way that made everyone wince. The line sat there glowing with importance, a perfect sentence that sounded like it had fallen straight from the sky and into the mouths of wise men who apparently spoke only in polished declarations. You copied it into your notebook with the kind of seriousness usually reserved for treasure maps, convinced that every great figure in history communicated exclusively through quotable lines that fit neatly on posters and coffee mugs. There was no hesitation, no context, no rambling warm-up, just pure verbal perfection. You never questioned why the quotes were always short enough to fit on a classroom wall. You never wondered what came before or after them. You simply accepted that old documents were crafted from clean, inspiring thoughts, spoken by people who understood liberty so clearly they could summarize it in a single sentence while wearing breeches and looking heroic. The adults in the room reinforced this idea every time they recited those lines with practiced reverence, like the quotes themselves were tiny keys unlocking the meaning of freedom. But when you grow older, you begin to notice the faint rattle of missing pieces. You discover that many of those quotes were not delivered with dramatic flair in candlelit rooms. Some were taken from long speeches, dense letters, private complaints, or even drafts the writers never intended to be displayed anywhere. You read the surrounding paragraphs and suddenly the meaning shifts, expands, complicates, or flips itself entirely. That soaring sentence you memorized turns out to have been followed by 2 pages of uncertainty, frustration, or something that would have made your childhood class immediately ask uncomfortable questions. You begin following the trail of these cherry-picked fragments, and the path winds in unexpected directions. You find quotes pulled from heated debates, used out of context to sound more inspiring or patriotic than they originally were. Others appear in textbooks without the messy qualifiers that came immediately afterward, qualifiers that reveal the speaker wrestling with contradictions you were never told about. The words you learned felt like crystal-clear declarations, but in reality they were pieces of conversations torn from their original environments, polished until they shined, and then shaped into slogans suitable for elementary school bulletin boards. It is strange at first, realizing how much nuance evaporated on the journey from the original source to your school desk. You think back to those worksheets where you were asked to explain what a quote meant, even though you were only given one sentence stripped of every detail that might have changed your answer. You realize how many times you wrote long explanations about liberty based on quotes that had been carefully trimmed, like fruit sliced into neat shapes so children would not choke on the seeds. Yet as you read the full passages, something unexpected happens. The founders and speakers grow more human. You see them thinking aloud, contradicting themselves, circling ideas, and trying to express things that were too big for a single phrase. Liberty becomes less of a slogan and more of a sprawling, unfinished question they were desperately trying to answer. The polished version felt simple, almost too simple, like a puzzle with missing pieces that you only noticed once you were old enough to see the gaps. You realize now that the quotes were chosen because they were easy to teach. Teachers needed sharp, memorable lines that fit into limited class periods and would not require footnotes longer than the lesson. Committees wanted statements that sounded unified, confident, and safe to display in hallways. No one meant to mislead you. They just needed something manageable, something that would stick in young minds that still forgot their lunchboxes. But as you follow the full trails, reading the complete paragraphs instead of the curated fragments, liberty grows more vivid and far more intricate. It becomes a conversation rather than a slogan, a struggle rather than a certainty, a process still unfolding rather than something solved centuries ago. And somehow, knowing the messy truth makes the idea feel larger. It stretches past the borders of the quotes you memorized, asking more of, to you, than a simple recitation ever could. You remember the way your teacher rolled down that giant pull-down map, the one that always snapped at the end like it was trying to startle the class into paying attention. Wars were introduced with colorful arrows sweeping across continents, bright lines showing troop movements, and little icons representing ships, cannons, and flags that looked suspiciously cheerful for something meant to represent danger. You watched as the map transformed into what felt like a tournament bracket, each battle a playoff round leading toward the championship of history. The winners advanced, the losers vanished. Everything was presented with the crisp certainty of a schedule taped to the gym door. You never heard about the noise, the fear, the hunger, or the waiting. Instead, you memorized dates, outcomes, and which side gained which piece of land, as if the entire point of a conflict was who moved forward on the chart. You drew arrows of your own on worksheets, tracing advances and retreats without ever stopping to imagine the human beings hidden under those arrows. People who did not move in smooth, confident lines, but in confusion, exhaustion, and dread. The textbook made it all feel strangely neat, like strategy was a puzzle and losses were just numbers instead of someone's entire world collapsing. As a kid, you accepted this version easily. It was clean, organized, and fit neatly into a multiple-choice quiz. You learned that one side pushed forward, another fell back, treaties were signed, and everyone moved on to the next chapter with their uniforms crisp and their posture perfect. The emotional weight never entered the room because there were 30 students and only one teacher trying desperately to keep the class from descending into chaos before the bell rang. The stories were trimmed to something that would not overwhelm young minds still struggling to remember which pocket they put their pencils in. But when you grow older, the simplicity begins to unravel. You encounter accounts that do not fit into tournament brackets. Letters from soldiers that sound nothing like the confident arrows in your textbook. Diary entries filled with longing, fear, confusion, and moments of bleak humor written by people who had no idea how the story would end. You discover that battles were not clean wins or losses, but spirals of suffering, decisions made under impossible conditions, and long shadows cast over people who would live with the consequences for the rest of their lives. You see that the aftermath of a single event could stretch for generations, lingering long after your textbook declared it was time to move on. Suddenly, those colorful arrows on the map feel almost absurd. You realize each one represents thousands of individual lives forced into motion, each with their own hopes, burdens, and loved ones waiting back home. The bracket-style storytelling erased the part where families waited for news that never came. It skipped the disease, the cold, the hunger, and the moments of unbearable silence. It polished everything until the human cost became invisible, replaced by bold lines and catchy chapter titles. You think back to your childhood self, copying battle names into a notebook, imagining wars as dramatic showdowns between two opposing sides that behaved like teams with mascots and game plans. You did not know that the truth was far more complicated and far more painful. You did not know that the people inside those lines were barely older than you are now, or that many of them had no interest in winning anything more than a chance to go home. And yet you understand why your teachers told it that way. How could they offer the full weight of tragedy to a room full of children who became emotional liabilities when their crayons rolled under someone else's desk? They needed the simplified version, the bracket version, the one that could be taught without breaking the room open. But now, as the fuller truth settles in, wars stop feeling like chapters and start feeling like shattered worlds. You no longer see arrows and outcomes. You see lives interrupted, futures erased, and entire histories rewritten in ways no colorful map ever showed you. You think back to those glossy textbook pages, the ones that smelled faintly like ink and cafeteria disinfectant, where every story felt strangely confident about who the heroes were, who the villains were, and what the moral should be. Back then, you never questioned why certain images were bigger, why certain stories were told with swelling pride, or why some events were treated like footnotes, while others received entire spreads filled with triumphant paintings. You assumed it was simply the way history worked, that the past naturally arranged itself into neat lessons designed to make you feel a certain way about your country. It never occurred to you that someone, somewhere, had arranged it for you. You remember the posters that decorated the classroom, too, the ones featuring bold slogans and illustrations of happy children holding flags or helping one another in choreographed harmony. They always looked like they came from a world where nobody ever disagreed and everyone knew exactly what their role was. You never noticed how those posters nudged you toward a certain feeling, a certain loyalty, a certain belief that the story of your country was not just important but unquestionably righteous. The messaging slipped in quietly, hidden beneath cheerful colors and encouraging phrases, the kind designed to be recited during assemblies without anyone asking follow-up questions. As a child, you did not have the vocabulary for the strange pressure these lessons carried. You only understood that some stories were told with proud certainty, while others were handled carefully, softened, or removed entirely. Some pages encouraged admiration, others encouraged silence. You thought this was normal, that every history book, everywhere, probably sounded the same, that grown-ups would never present information with an agenda. Truth belonged to the textbooks, and textbooks belonged to the world of absolute certainty. But then you grow older, and the curtain lifts just a little. You begin noticing moments where the language in those old lessons sounds suspiciously polished. You realize how certain phrases were designed to steer your feelings rather than present information. Stories you once accepted without blinking now feel strangely selective, like someone reached into the past and rearranged the pieces until they supported a single, tidy narrative. You begin to see how specific words were chosen to elevate, soften, or obscure, and how repetition gave those words weight. The messaging that once felt invisible now glows like a backlit sign. You look back and realize that some history lessons sounded less like education and more like seasoning, sprinkled lightly with emotional cues meant to shape your worldview. You remember how often you heard phrases about destiny, bravery, unity, and greatness, repeated so consistently that they began to feel like facts. The materials never announced themselves as propaganda, because propaganda never does. It arrives wrapped in familiarity, disguised as tradition, delivered with the confidence of someone saying, "Trust us. This is how it has always been told." You imagine the adults who selected these materials, not as sinister architects of manipulation, but as people immersed in the same narratives, people who genuinely believed these stories shaped good citizens. They were not creating propaganda in the cartoonish sense, with secret meetings and dramatic music playing in the background. They were repeating what they had learned, passing along the same polished tales that once shaped them, unaware of how the edges had been sanded down over generations until the original complexity had all but disappeared. When you revisit those old lessons now, you can feel the subtle pressure you once absorbed without noticing. You see how pride was encouraged before understanding, how emotion was shaped before knowledge, how certain interpretations were offered as the only ones worth considering. And yet, recognizing this does not unravel your entire childhood. Instead, it gives you something sturdier than the narratives you were handed. It gives you the ability to look at the past with clear eyes, aware of the shaping forces behind the stories, and to seek out the truth that was always waiting beneath the polished surface. You think back to the classroom corner where the national symbols lived, arranged on a bulletin board with the same solemnity usually reserved for religious icons or particularly well-behaved pets. The bald eagle perched proudly in the center, chest puffed out, eyes sharp, looking like it had never once struggled with wind or hunger or the indignities of being a bird. The flag shimmered on laminated paper, frozen mid-wave as if it had just heard applause. The Liberty Bell sat beneath them, cracked yet majestic, as though even its flaws were part of the marketing package. You learned their stories, as if they had always carried the exact meanings assigned to them. Each symbol born perfect, each legend carved into place on the day it entered the national imagination. Back then, you memorized their origins with complete trust. The eagle stood for courage. The bell represented freedom. The flag was stitched so lovingly it practically glowed. Nothing in the lessons suggested that these symbols had ever been debated, doubted, or criticized, or that their meanings had drifted and expanded in ways no committee could have fully predicted. Each story came with the gentle tone of an adult, hoping you would feel pride, not questions. You absorbed every detail the way children absorb everything, with the wide-eyed certainty that if something sits on a classroom wall, it must be true. Only later do you start noticing the strange shine that coated those childhood stories. You learn that the eagle was not chosen unanimously, that some people found it unruly, scavenging, and frankly a little rude. You learn that the Liberty Bell did not become a national treasure until long after it had already cracked. And even then, its fame was encouraged by people who needed a powerful symbol to rally around. You learn that flags change designs over and over, evolving like fashion trends, adapting to politics, expansion, and the messy realities of a growing country. None of this appeared in your childhood chapters. Symbols were presented as if they had descended onto the land fully formed, haloed by meaning rather than shaped by circumstance. It is almost funny, discovering how many embellishments found their way into the stories. The dramatic scenes were exaggerated. The polished details were added later. The meanings that felt ancient were often younger than the school buildings you learned them in. You realize how many of these narratives were shaped by people trying to build unity, bolster identity, or simply make the past sound more cinematic during times when reality felt too uncertain. The embellishments were not accidental. They were crafted, repeated, and eventually tucked into textbooks as if they had always been there. You revisit the symbols with these new eyes, and suddenly they feel more alive. They are no longer static objects, frozen in mythology, but living artifacts that traveled through wars, movements, reinventions, and countless generations of interpretation. You see that their strength comes not from flawless origins, but from the way people kept returning to them, reshaping their meanings to fit a changing world. The eagle stopped being a bird and became a metaphor. The bell stopped being a damaged hunk of metal and became a rallying cry. The flag became a canvas onto which millions projected hope, pride, worry, anger, and memory. You think back to your younger self believing that these symbols had never been questioned, never misunderstood, never repurposed, that they had always been exactly what the posters claimed. Now you understand that the real story is more complicated. Symbols gain power not because they are perfect, but because people invest them with meaning, generation after generation, layering belief on top of belief until the story becomes inseparable from the object itself. In the end, the embellishments do not diminish the symbols. They reveal the deep human need to anchor ourselves to something larger, something steady, something we can point to in times of confusion and say, this still matters. And somehow, knowing the truth makes them feel more authentic than the polished tales you once memorized in that bright, quiet classroom. You think back to the oversized classroom map that hung above the whiteboard, the one that always curled at the corners like it was trying to escape. You stared at it day after day, memorizing continents shaped like cartoon animals and borders drawn in colors that made the world seem neatly organized, as if every region had politely agreed to stop shifting long enough for students to finish their quizzes. The oceans were a smooth, unbroken blue that suggested calm water at all times, and the mountains rose in gentle bumps instead of the jagged, terrifying formations they actually are. You learned that deserts were simple tan shapes, forests were green blobs, and rivers were thin blue lines that behaved themselves far more than real rivers ever do. Back then, the world felt as flat and friendly as the poster made it appear. You believed you could look at a country's outline and understand something about the people who lived there, the climate, the culture, the history. You assumed that borders were permanent, that landscapes were stable, and that your map represented a perfect snapshot of reality. When your teacher pointed to a region with a wooden stick that made a loud clacking noise, you accepted whatever came next without question. The map said it. Therefore, it was true. Years later, you begin to revisit those lessons with an older mind, and the whole thing starts to wobble. You discover that the map you memorized was distorted, stretched, or shrunk, depending on which projection was used. Countries that looked huge in your childhood classroom turn out to be far smaller, and places you barely noticed occupy more space on the planet than you ever imagined. You realize that the tidy outlines you learned were the result of cartographers wrestling with a sphere that stubbornly refused to flatten without turning parts of the world into funhouse reflections. Geography suddenly becomes less about clean shapes and more about compromise. Then there were the borders, those tidy lines that once seemed unquestionable. You find out they shifted constantly through wars, treaties, migrations, and arguments that lasted longer than your entire school career. The lines you memorized were simply the version that existed at the exact moment your textbook was published. No one told you they were temporary. No one mentioned that countless people had lived, loved, fought, and died along those edges, or that many of those lines were drawn with remarkable carelessness by people who never set foot on the land they were dividing. Even physical geography begins to lose its simplicity. You learn that rivers change course, coasts erode, forests shrink, and climates shift in ways your childhood maps never hinted at. The neat green blobs start to feel misleading, because the real world is a patchwork of ecosystems far more complex than a color code could ever communicate. You begin to understand that the world is in motion, restless and alive, and that your childhood map was only a still frame from a film that never stops moving. What surprises you most is how those early lessons shaped your internal map, the one inside your mind. For years, you imagined distances, directions, and relative sizes based on that classroom poster. It guided the way you pictured travel, conflict, and connection. It influenced how you thought about faraway places, helping you form opinions long before you had any meaningful information. The map lived in your memory far longer than the worksheets or quizzes. It became part of the way you thought about the planet itself. Now you see the gaps, the distortions, the simplifications, but you also understand why the map was presented that way. Children need something they can hold in their minds, something stable and colorful and not yet complicated by all the shifting details. They need an entry point, even if that entry point is flawed. The real world arrives later, with all its surprising proportions and inconvenient truths, and once it does, you finally understand that the map was never the world. It was only the beginning of learning how much more there is to see. You remember sitting at your tiny desk as your teacher drew simple arrows on the board, each one connecting neatly to the next, like a row of dominoes set up by someone who never anticipated a breeze. Economic history was explained to you as a perfectly behaved chain of events. One thing caused another. That thing caused the next. And soon the entire world apparently changed because the universe followed a tidy checklist. You learned that a crisis happened because of a single mistake. Prosperity arrived because someone made a good decision, and downturns occurred when someone else made a bad one. It all seemed orderly, predictable, and about as complicated as a children's book about saving your allowance. Back then, the economy felt like a giant machine where every gear turned smoothly, never grinding, stalling, or flying off into space. Your textbooks laid out the big moments with cheerful clarity, as though recess would be ruined if you knew that real economic systems behaved more like a tangled knot than a clean line. You memorized causes and effects the way you memorized multiplication tables, not because you understood them deeply, but because they were shaped to be digestible. Every chart had straight lines. Every graph had colors chosen to soothe you. Even disasters were described like natural hiccups instead of storms built from thousands of overlapping decisions. As a child, you accepted all of it. It never occurred to you that the diagrams left out millions of people making contradictory choices, reacting to fear or hope or misinformation. You did not question why entire eras were summarized in a handful of bullet-sized explanations. Prices rose because of this. Trade collapsed because of that. Jobs disappeared because someone somewhere made one unfortunate choice, conveniently circled in red at the top of the page. You never saw the confusion, the political debates, or the desperation that fueled those shifts. Everything flowed as smoothly as the arrows suggested. But years later, something starts to unravel. You read into the stories you once took for granted and discover that none of them were ever that simple. What looked like a single cause was really a swarm of influences. What seemed like a predictable effect was shaped by countless people making decisions under pressure, influenced by rumors, policies, fears, and unexpected events no one bothered to mention. You learn that economic history is less of a chain and more of a web, stretched in every direction, tugged by forces that have no interest in staying organized for the sake of a fifth-grade quiz. Suddenly, those tidy lessons feel almost comical. You picture adults trying to explain the chaos of human behavior using nothing but a simple line and a few cheerful illustrations of coin stacks. You imagine committees deciding that children probably should not be exposed to concepts like speculation, debt cycles, or the unnerving truth that sometimes nobody knows exactly what happened until decades later. So, they trimmed away the complexity, smoothed the jagged edges, and delivered something that looked like a calm story instead of a panic-filled saga. You start noticing how the simplified cause and effect chains shaped your thinking long before you learned the truth. You spent years believing that big events had singular explanations, that economies rose and fell with the predictability of a seesaw. It made the world feel manageable, even fair. But once you begin to understand how many invisible hands shape every decision, how many unpredictable factors collide to form an outcome, the whole picture grows both larger and more human. You revisit those early lessons and feel the shift inside yourself. You see how much was lost in the simplification, yet you also understand why it was delivered that way. Children need order long before they can face uncertainty. They need beginnings, middles, and ends, even when the truth refuses to follow that script. And now, with a fuller view, the world no longer feels like a row of dominoes. It feels like a vast, intricate pattern, shaped by millions of minds moving at once, never tidy, never simple, but endlessly alive. You remember the first time your teacher introduced the frontier, that mythical place where everyone supposedly woke up at dawn, wrestled a bear before breakfast, and built a cabin with nothing but determination and a suspiciously sharp axe. The pictures in your textbook showed families smiling in freshly ironed clothing despite living miles from the nearest laundry facility. The sun always seemed to hit the log walls at just the right angle, giving everything a heroic glow. You learned that frontier life was rugged but noble, difficult but wholesome, dangerous but somehow also charming, like a historical version of camping with higher stakes and better posture. Back then, you accepted it without blinking. Your mind filled with images of endless plains, brave settlers striding purposefully toward opportunity, and tidy homesteads rising from the earth through sheer willpower. If there were hardships, they came in the form of manageable storybook challenges, a bad storm, a mischievous raccoon, a moment of courage where someone decided that quitting simply was not an option. You never wondered why the families looked so clean or why the cabins looked suspiciously symmetrical. You simply trusted that life on the frontier was a heroic adventure that unfolded with the rhythm of an upbeat folk song. Only later do you start to notice the cracks in the myth. You learn that frontier life was more chaos than postcard, more exhaustion than triumph. You discover that cabins were often cramped, damp, and drafty enough to make you question whether wood even had insulating properties. The friendly wildlife from your childhood illustrations becomes a swarm of insects that cared nothing for human dreams. Food was scarce, water was unpredictable, illness arrived uninvited, and the nearest doctor might be several days away if a doctor existed at all. You begin to understand that most frontier days were not filled with brave heroics, but with constant labor, relentless uncertainty, and an unending series of chores that made modern life feel downright luxurious. You learn that the frontier was not empty land waiting politely for settlers to arrive. It was home to indigenous peoples with their own histories, cultures, and ways of life. People who were pushed aside, displaced, or worse, all while your childhood lessons skipped lightly over the details. You were taught about wagon trains and brave pioneers, but not about the tension, conflict, and grief woven into every mile of westward movement. The myth carved out a version of history that fit easily into your young mind, even if it left entire truths outside the frame. What surprises you most is how deeply the myth shaped your imagination. The frontier became a symbol of independence, bravery, and opportunity long before you knew what any of those words meant. For years you pictured the West as a proving ground for courage rather than a landscape where countless families struggled simply to survive. The stories left you with an image of the past that was polished, simplified, and framed with optimism. It made the world feel safe, even when the reality was anything but. As the truth settles in, the frontier shifts in your mind. It becomes both harsher and more human. You begin to see the settlers not as icons, but as people carrying fear, hope, exhaustion, and stubbornness in equal measure. You imagine them patching leaks in the roof during freezing nights, nursing sickness without medicine, arguing over dwindling supplies, and waking each morning unsure whether the land would sustain them or swallow their efforts. They were not the flawless pioneers your childhood books portrayed. They were people trying desperately to build a life at the edge of the unknown. Now the frontier feels less like a legend and more like a fragile reality shaped by hardship, resilience, conflict, and an overwhelming desire for something better. The myth does not disappear, but it becomes transparent, allowing the truth to shine through its thinning edges. And you finally see that the real story, the one hidden beneath the polished version, has far more weight than the frontier fantasies you once believed without question. You remember the first time your textbook introduced a social movement. It appeared on the page like a tidy parade, led by one or two heroic figures who always stood front and center, illuminated by the glow of inevitability. Their names were printed in bold, their quotes polished to perfection, and their expressions serious in that noble, cinematic way that suggested they had never doubted themselves for even a second. Behind them marched a crowd of smiling supporters, all drawn at the same size, all apparently free of disagreement or exhaustion. The message was clear. Change came from a few extraordinary people who said a few extraordinary things, and the rest of society simply followed along as if participating in a well-choreographed dance. Back then, you did not question it. You memorized the key names, the key phrases, and the key dates that formed the spine of the lesson. It felt manageable, almost comforting, to believe that history moved forward because a small number of perfect individuals pushed it in the right direction. The movement itself slipped neatly into a few paragraphs, just long enough for a quiz, but not long enough to complicate anything. You pictured progress as a straight line powered by speeches that seemed to echo through time with spotless clarity. The messy parts were quietly edited out, like background noise. Only later do you begin to sense the weight of everything that was left out. You discover that those movements were not silent crowds following a single leader, but massive, unpredictable ecosystems filled with disagreements, strategies, rivalries, sacrifices, and long stretches where nothing seemed to work. You read about people who dedicated their entire lives to a cause and never made it into a single textbook. You find accounts of organizers, protesters, writers, students, parents, workers, and people who stood in the streets, who risked their safety, who lost jobs, who faced threats, who kept going even when the world barely noticed. You realize that the heroes you learned about were essential, yes, but they were not alone. They were held up by thousands of hands the textbooks never bothered to mention. As you keep learning, the polished quotes you memorized start to feel strangely incomplete. You read the full speeches and find the uncertainty, the anger, the nuance, the humor, and the exhaustion hidden beneath the tidy lines your lessons highlighted. Some of those quotes were delivered in moments of fear. Some were spoken to small rooms, not roaring crowds. Some were written after nights of despair, not during triumphant breakthroughs. The real voices behind those movements crackled with complexity, far too alive to fit into the trimmed versions handed to you as a kid. You start imagining how many people the simplified narrative erased. The activists who printed flyers late at night, the volunteers who cooked meals, the children who marched, the elders who advised, the neighbors who sheltered leaders, the communities who stepped into danger long before the cameras arrived. You see how the story shrank so drastically that only a few names survived, as if movements were powered by lone heroes instead of entire populations refusing to stay silent. Then you recognize something even stranger. The simplified version shaped the way you pictured activism itself. For years, you believed change required someone extraordinary, someone who spoke in perfect lines and never made mistakes. You did not see yourself anywhere in the picture because the picture did not include ordinary people. It left out the ones who made phone calls, held signs, wrote letters, organized rides, chanted until their voices cracked, or simply showed up. The missing faces created the illusion that history only listened to a select few. Now, with clearer eyes, the movements you learned about feel larger than anything your childhood lessons allowed. They become messy and human, filled with courage, fear, stubbornness, hope, frustration, and resilience. They stop being simple stories about heroes delivering perfect quotes. They become stories about communities refusing to settle for the world as it was. And once you see the fuller truth, you cannot unsee it. The movements grow deeper, wider, more powerful. The erased people return. The quiet labor becomes visible. The quotes expand into whole voices. And you finally understand that progress was never the work of a few extraordinary figures. It was the work of countless ordinary ones who chose to do something when doing nothing would have been easier. You remember sitting in class watching your teacher hold up a picture of an inventor, usually a stern-looking person with spectacular hair, and explain that one day this brilliant mind simply had an idea. The idea arrived fully formed, apparently like a lightning bolt of genius striking in the middle of a peaceful afternoon. The inventor would then leap out of bed, grab a tool, and create something world-changing before dinner. The The story always paused at this moment so you could appreciate how incredible it all was, how effortlessly brilliance seemed to bloom when the right person happened to be standing nearby. You never wondered where the half-finished prototypes went, or how many times things caught fire before success arrived. Back then, inventions felt magical. Your textbook presented them with bright diagrams and simple captions, each one focusing on the final form rather than the long, frustrating process behind it. You learned that great ideas happened quickly, that breakthroughs were almost guaranteed if someone was smart enough, and that history moved forward in sudden jumps, driven by people who barely broke a sweat while reshaping the world. It was a clean narrative, with no room for doubt, fear, or the smell of burning metal. The inventors in the stories rarely looked tired. None of them ever sat on the floor staring at a pile of broken parts, wondering where they had gone wrong. When you revisit these stories later, the shine begins to fade in a way that reveals something far more interesting. You discover that most inventions took years to refine, that early versions barely functioned, and that many so-called breakthroughs were accidents or the cumulative efforts of teams working through endless trial and error. You learn that inventors kept notebooks filled with crossed-out pages, that they argued with colleagues, panicked over finances, questioned themselves constantly, and sometimes abandoned projects entirely before circling back. The sudden flash of brilliance was usually the final moment in a chain that stretched across countless late nights and abandoned drafts. You begin to notice that the textbook version left out the failures, probably because schools feared that children would latch onto the wrong lesson and decide giving up sounded easier. Struggle did not fit neatly into a single chapter. It was messy, unpredictable, and inconvenient for standardized tests. So the stories were trimmed until they resembled inspirational posters rather than human lives. You were handed the final scene of a long play without seeing the first 20 acts, and you never realized anything was missing. As you read deeper, inventions stop feeling like miracles and start feeling like marathons. You imagine inventors pacing small rooms, tinkering until their hands ached, muttering to themselves while adjusting a screw for the 50th time, celebrating tiny successes that did not look like successes at all to anyone else. You picture their families, worrying about money, their friends wondering if they had gone a little mad, and their rivals working on similar ideas in another crowded workshop across town. You see how invention was not a moment of brilliance, but a life shaped by stubbornness and frustration, anchored by a hope that refused to go quiet. You realize that the myth of sudden genius shaped your expectations long before you understood how anything was actually made. For years you believed that great ideas arrived without warning, and that if you were not struck by inspiration, you simply were not meant to create anything worthwhile. The truth, when it finally reaches you, feels almost liberating. Brilliance was never the point. Persistence was, curiosity was, patience was, the willingness to keep trying even when everything wobbled was. Now the inventors in your memory look different. They seem less like untouchable figures drawn with perfect certainty, and more like real people navigating an unforgiving process, sweating over details that never made it into the textbooks. The story becomes richer, more human, more honest, and you finally understand that invention was never a single spark. It was a long, flickering struggle that shaped the world one stubborn attempt at a time. You remember the way your textbooks loved to present the classroom hero, that gleaming figure who always stood up for what was right, spoke with unwavering clarity, and apparently never said anything awkward in their entire life. They were the moral compass of every lesson, the person whose decisions carried a glow so bright you almost needed sunglasses just to read the paragraph. They were brave, kind, self-sacrificing, and entirely certain of themselves, the sort of person who would help a stranger, rescue a puppy, and then invent a new form of justice before bedtime. You learned early on that these were the people worth admiring, the ones who made every choice with a purity that felt almost supernatural. Back then, you accepted this template without hesitation. The stories made it sound like the world could be divided into two simple groups: the heroes, who always chose correctly, and everyone else, who mostly existed to clap during assemblies. The heroes were never confused, never hypocritical, never torn between conflicting needs. Their intentions were always pure, their voices always strong, their motivations always noble. They were the moral version of a superhero, minus the cape and with slightly better historical references. It never occurred to you that real people rarely behave this way. It never occurred to you that the stories had been trimmed into shape, softened at the edges, and rearranged until they resembled fables more than history. You saw the final product, but never the messy drafts. You heard the speeches, but never the arguments that happened right before them. You read about their victories, but never their doubts, frustrations, or the nights they sat alone wondering if they had made everything worse. The classroom hero you learned about was less a person and more a symbol polished until it lost every fingerprint. Only later do you start discovering the human beings behind the myth. You read letters filled with hesitation, journal entries filled with contradictions, and accounts that reveal just how conflicted even the most admired figures often were. You find stories of flawed individuals trying their best in impossible circumstances, people who made mistakes, apologized, tried again, stumbled, learned, and kept going. Their paths were never straight. Their choices were rarely simple. They were brave in ways that did not fit inside 30 minutes of curriculum. It is strange at first, confronting the distance between the hero you learned about and the person they actually were. You realize how much was cut out to create the version suitable for children, the one that would not lead to uncomfortable questions about morality, power, consequences, or the haunting truth that even good people sometimes do the wrong thing. The classroom needed the myth to stay clean because the real world was too complicated to hand to a group of kids who still needed reminders not to eat glue. But as the truth settles, something unexpected happens. The real figures begin to feel far more inspiring than the flawless versions you once memorized. Their courage becomes deeper, grounded in fear and uncertainty rather than perfection. Their strength becomes more recognizable, built from persistence rather than magic. You see how hard they fought, not just against the world, but against themselves, wrestling with doubt, learning from failure, and doing what they believed was right, even when doing so came with consequences they never asked for. You begin to understand what the myth took away. The flawed human behind the legend is not less deserving of admiration. They are more deserving. They show you that moral courage is not about purity. It is about making choices without guarantees, standing up even when your voice shakes, and holding to your principles when everything around you feels unsteady. The polished archetype fades, replaced by a person who feels startlingly real. Someone who lived through fears the textbooks never mentioned. Someone who struggled with responsibilities that would break most people. Someone who made mistakes and still found a way to move forward. And once you see them clearly, you realize the truth that childhood lessons never gave you. Heroes are not born perfect. They are shaped in the quiet, painful, uncertain moments when no one is watching. They are not symbols. They are people. You remember watching your teachers pace at the front of the room, clutching their lesson plans like lifelines, trying to guide you through a curriculum that always seemed perfectly polished on paper, yet strangely hollow once spoken aloud. They followed the script because they had to, pointing to charts and vocabulary lists that came pre-packaged with cheerful illustrations and an optimism that rarely matched reality. But every now and then, something slipped. A pause, a sigh, a quiet glance at the ceiling that suggested the material left more unsaid than said. You did not notice it at the time because you were busy trying to keep your pencil from rolling off the desk. Yet the signs were there, subtle hints that your teachers were navigating gaps they were never allowed to acknowledge. You remember the way certain topics were introduced with a slightly forced smile, as if enthusiasm could hide the missing pieces. A chapter would mention an event but skip the reasons behind it. A sentence would make a bold claim but never show the evidence. A whole era would be summarized so neatly that it felt suspicious, though you were too young to understand why. Your teachers would hover at the edge of these gaps, gently nudging you forward without lingering long enough for anyone to ask the questions, spinning quietly in their own minds. They were following instructions, doing their best to build a bridge over material that had been trimmed until only the safest facts remained. Back then, you thought teachers knew everything. You believed that if something was missing from the lesson, it must not be important. You never considered that your teachers might have wanted to tell you more but were boxed in by testing schedules, district rules, or the silent threat of angry parent emails. You did not see how often they chose their words carefully, how they softened complicated truths to avoid stepping outside the boundaries drawn around them. The curriculum was a map with bright colors and numbered sections, but your teachers knew how many roads were missing. As you grow older, you begin to understand the strain behind those pauses. You recall the moments when a teacher's eyes flickered with a kind of restrained honesty, the kind that said, "There is more here, but I cannot tell you everything." You learn that teachers often filled the gaps in quiet ways, slipping in context during a discussion, hinting at nuance with a raised eyebrow, or assigning a book that said what the textbook could not. They wove truth between the lines, hoping you would catch the threads without attracting the attention of anyone who might object. You start to see your teachers as navigators in a tight space, steering through lessons that lacked the depth they wished they could offer. You imagine them reading the curriculum the night before school started, realizing entire stories were missing, knowing they could not rewrite the material but determined to soften its edges where they could. You picture them faced with rigid standards that rewarded memorization over understanding, watching students dutifully fill in blanks that left little room for questions. The more you think about it, the more remarkable it becomes. Your teachers were not simply reciting information, they were improvising around silence, translating incomplete narratives into something meaningful, trying to protect your curiosity from shrinking under the weight of simplified content. They encouraged discussion even when the answers were complicated, encouraged thinking even when the curriculum discouraged wandering beyond the page. Now, with a fuller view of the world and all its tangled history, you look back on those classrooms with a different kind of appreciation. You realize your teachers were often walking a narrow path, balancing truth and permission, depth and requirement. They taught within the lines but reached beyond them whenever they could, hoping you would eventually seek the missing pieces on your own. And in many ways, you are doing exactly that now. You remember the way your local history lessons used to feel like a warm blanket, soft, familiar, and just comforting enough to make you forget that the world outside the classroom was far more complicated than the cheerful stories in your textbook. The lessons always began with a friendly anecdote about the town founder, a kindly figure who apparently never raised their voice, never made a questionable decision, and never once experienced a bad hair day. The map on the wall showed tidy streets, modest buildings, and a timeline that glided smoothly from one milestone to the next, as if your town had been built through a series of polite conversations and well-organized community picnics. In those days, the narrative felt natural. You learned about brave settlers who arrived with hopeful hearts, about small businesses that sprang up through determination alone, about the town square where everyone gathered happily, as though disagreements had been politely outlawed. You were taught the local legends, the charming stories that gave your town its personality, the ones people told at festivals with a smile that suggested these tales were as solid as the pavement beneath your feet. Growing up, you accepted it without question because the stories made the place feel special, almost magical, like a stage set lovingly arranged for you and your classmates. Only later do you start to notice the soft spots in that comforting version of the past. You learn that the founder was not quite the gentle figure your textbook painted, that some of the early successes came from circumstances conveniently brushed aside, and that the peaceful origins of the town hid conflicts that no one ever mentioned. You find out that entire communities existed here, long before the starting point. The school insisted on celebrating communities with traditions, languages, and histories that barely earned a paragraph in your childhood lessons. You begin to see how the cozy narrative left out anything that disrupted its pleasant rhythm, smoothing over hardship, erasing friction, and skipping straight to the feel-good version. You start remembering the moments when your teachers hesitated, just slightly, as if they sensed the missing pieces, but did not have the permission, time, or resources to fill them in. A question from a curious student would drift into the classroom, something innocent but precise, and your teacher would smile carefully and say that the topic would be covered later, even though later never arrived. It was as if the curriculum believed you needed a softened world, not a truthful one. As you learn more, the town's history begins to deepen. You picture the early days not as a series of cheerful milestones, but as a jumble of ambition, tension, and uneasy compromise. You imagine political arguments outside the tidy frame of your textbook illustrations, people wrestling with choices that shaped the town in ways the curriculum pretended were inevitable. You see how migration, industry, and conflict all played roles that were too messy for the elementary school version. The truth is more tangled, more human, and strangely more fascinating than the version you grew up with. You realize your childhood lessons were designed to make you feel rooted and proud, to give you a story simple enough to grasp before you knew how complicated the world could be. But now, with wider eyes and a fuller picture, you feel the weight of the missing truths. You understand that every cozy tale has a shadow behind it, a part of the story that was shaved off to make the narrative smoother. And when you finally let those hidden pieces back in, the place you once thought you knew becomes richer, sharper, and far more real. You look at your town with a new kind of awareness. It is no longer the neatly illustrated community your textbook promised. It is something deeper, shaped by countless hands and countless choices, beautiful in ways that have nothing to do with spotless stories. You remember flipping through your old textbooks, the pages bright with cheerful illustrations that made even the darkest chapters look like scenes from a weekend craft project. Every difficult moment in history seemed to have been filtered through a gentle watercolor palette, as if the artists had been instructed to paint tragedy the same way they would paint a spring picnic. A battle looked strangely tidy, the kind where no one appeared sweaty or terrified. A famine looked like a slightly disappointing harvest festival. Entire struggles were transformed into soft edges, round faces, and pastel skies, all designed to make you think, well, that does not look so bad. Back then, these drawings worked exactly as intended. You were young, and the world felt enormous enough already. The illustrations gave you something to hold on to, something manageable. You saw smiling pioneers, even though their real lives were anything but easy. You saw neatly lined rows of soldiers marching in perfect formation, as if war were just a very serious parade. You saw explorers posing heroically on cliffs that looked suspiciously stable, with no sign of the storms, sickness, or despair that shaped their journeys. Everything harsh was softened, until it seemed almost gentle. As a child, you trusted the images. You did not question why everyone looked clean or why the emotional weight of an event could be lifted so completely by a well-placed patch of sunlight. You did not wonder why certain faces were missing or why some scenes seemed suspiciously quiet. You simply believed that history had unfolded with fewer rough edges than you imagined, that conflict and hardship had been the sort of thing one could resolve by turning to a fresh page. Only later do you realize how much those illustrations left out. When you revisit these same periods in history through adult eyes, the contrast hits you with a kind of quiet force. You learn about the conditions people endured, the fear that seeped into every decision, the violence that carved itself into families and landscapes. None of this appears in the soft lines of your childhood textbook. Instead, the images acted like curtains, gently pulled across the stage to shield you from the truth. You begin noticing the choices behind the art, the absence of smoke in a drawing of a battlefield, The way indigenous communities were depicted with decorative simplicity rather than cultural depth. The use of bright colors during eras defined by scarcity and pain. You see that the illustrations were not merely artistic interpretations. They were deliberate, crafted to keep the material safe, manageable, and palatable for young students who were expected to memorize dates, not wrestle with grief. You start imagining the real scenes behind those gentle drawings. A village emptied by disease, the sky not pastel but heavy with dread. A crowd in the midst of protest, faces tense, not rounded and serene. A family displaced, carrying everything they owned, not strolling calmly with tidy bundles. The distance between what you saw and what happened grows clearer, a gap wide enough to hide entire truths. Yet the more you uncover, the less angry you feel and the more curious you become. You understand that the artists were working under constraints, just like your teachers. They had to present something children could handle, something administrators would approve, something that would not lead to phone calls from parents demanding to know why little students came home asking about atrocities before dinner. The illustrations were never meant to deceive maliciously. They were meant to protect, even if that protection came at the cost of honesty. Now, when you think back to those drawings, they seem almost fragile. They feel like windows with frosted glass, offering shapes but not details, outlines but not emotions. And as you clear the frost away with your own questions, you discover a history that is sharper, darker, and far more human than the soft pages ever revealed. You remember the timelines printed across the tops of your old history pages, those perfectly straight lines, neatly divided into labeled segments that looked more like a commuter schedule than the messy churn of human events. Everything seemed to unfold with the polite efficiency of a train arriving exactly on time, each moment lined up in a cheerful row of boxes that hinted at a past free of confusion or overlap. You believed the world moved forward with clean transitions, one event giving way to the next, like a well-choreographed dance where everyone knew their cues and no one tripped over their own feet. Back then, it never occurred to you that history did not actually operate in such a coordinated manner. The timelines told you that discoveries happened first, then exploration, then settlement, as if no one ever discovered something by accident or wandered somewhere out of desperation rather than ambition. Wars began on a crisp date and ended on another, apparently without any lingering tension or unresolved bitterness. Social movements started after breakfast and wrapped up before sunset, if the neat sequence of arrows and captions was to be believed. The timelines smoothed over everything until the past looked as predictable as a school calendar. You absorbed these sequences without question because they made the world easier to understand. A tidy order created the illusion of logic, as if history were a chain of carefully placed dominoes rather than 1,000 scattered pieces falling in different directions at once. You accepted that this was how things unfolded, how decisions were made, how cause connected to effect with the straightforward clarity of a math equation. Only later do you start to realize that the timelines you trusted were more like suggestions than reflections of reality. You learn that events overlapped, collided, and influenced one another in ways the diagrams never hinted at. A conflict that seemed to start on a single date had actually been brewing for years. A movement that appeared spontaneous was really the result of countless small actions hidden beneath the surface. A cultural shift did not begin neatly after another, ended, but instead simmered alongside it, tangled and inseparable. The past did not move in a line. It spiraled, doubled back, unraveled, and rebuilt itself in ways that no ruler's straightened chart could ever capture. You begin revisiting the timelines with new eyes, noticing the parts that once looked harmless but now feel strangely misleading. You see how rearranging events can create a narrative that feels inevitable, as if the outcomes of history were written before they happened. You see how timelines can erase the slow buildup of tension, the contradictions inside decisions, the years of pressure that lead to a single explosive moment. You realize that the smooth flow you once admired was the result of someone making choices about what to include, what to skip, and what to place conveniently out of the way. You picture your teachers trying to explain centuries of chaos to a room full of restless students using only a handful of arrows and a rectangle filled with dates. They had to condense overlapping stories into a shape children could digest, even if doing so meant shaving off the confusion. It was not deception as much as survival. No one wanted to spend an entire unit explaining why history refused to obey the structure of a tidy chart. Still, when you reflect on it now, the truth feels far more compelling than the simplified version you once believed. You imagine history as a living thing, pulsing with conflict and contradiction, a web rather than a line. The events bleed into each other, each thread tugging at another, forming patterns that take time and perspective to understand. And as those threads reveal themselves, the past becomes more vivid, more unpredictable, and far more human than the tidy timelines ever allowed. You remember the excitement that used to rush through the classroom whenever a historical reenactment day was announced. That peculiar blend of anticipation and mild chaos that made even the quiet students sit up a little straighter. The desks would be pushed aside, construction paper would appear in improbable quantities, and suddenly everyone was transformed into some iconic figure from the past, usually wearing a costume held together with glue sticks and blind optimism. You remember the whispers, the laughter, the smell of felt and washable markers, the sense that you were stepping into history itself. It felt important. It felt magical. It felt like you were being handed a key to the past. Back then, the reenactments seemed completely authentic. If you wrapped a scarf around your head, you were instantly transported to a time of brave settlers. If you wore an apron or carried a cardboard musket, you had stepped into a world of legendary figures. Your teacher would narrate events as if they were unfolding right before your eyes, and you believed every word because the whole room vibrated with imagination. The reenactments made the past feel simple, clear, and almost theatrical, like history had been waiting patiently backstage for a group of children to perform it. Only later do you start to realize how curated those reenactments really were. The messy parts had been quietly removed, swept away like confetti after a school play. You begin remembering the way certain scenes were left out entirely, replaced with cheerful activities that had nothing to do with what actually happened. The hardship of daily life became a fun chore rotation. Conflicts were turned into harmless pretend disagreements. Entire peoples were represented by 2 sentences read from an index card. You begin to see how the reenactments were not reflections of the past, but carefully filtered versions designed to keep the mood light and the questions manageable. You recall the projects too, the dioramas and poster boards that reduced entire eras into glitter-covered trifold displays. A gold rush scene became a handful of plastic pebbles hot, glued to cardboard. A settlement became a cluster of popsicle stick, houses that looked far more stable than anything the real settlers ever built. You worked so hard on these projects, not knowing that the simplified world you crafted was missing the tension, uncertainty, and discomfort that defined the actual events. It all felt educational, even though the lessons were softened until they lost their edge. As you grow older and revisit the same history with clearer eyes, the reenactments take on an entirely different shape. You imagine what it would have looked like if even a fraction of reality had slipped into those cheerful scenes. Children reenacting battles would suddenly know fear. Children portraying settlers would know hunger, cold, and uncertainty. The classroom would lose its bright innocence, replaced by questions too heavy for glue and construction paper to hold. You start to appreciate the complicated balancing act your teachers performed. They had to introduce history without crushing anyone under the weight of it. They had to honor the past while protecting the present. They had to spark curiosity without overwhelming you with more truth than you were ready to carry. So the reenactments became stories trimmed to fit childhood, stories with rounded corners and softened shadows, stories that preserved the idea of history without the burden of its pain. Now, When you think back to those classroom performances, they feel both sweet and slightly surreal. You see the charm in them, the creativity, the joy of learning with your whole body instead of just your eyes. But you also see the missing pieces, the silences between the scenes, the truths tucked away until you were old enough to face them. And in that contrast, you finally understand something you never grasped as a child. The reenactments were not meant to show you the past. They were meant to guide you toward it, gently, carefully, one cardboard prop at a time. You remember how your history book always felt strangely confident, as if every chapter had been carved in stone by wise, impartial scholars, sitting in a serene library with perfect lighting and an unlimited supply of tea. Back then, it never crossed your mind that the true shaping force behind those chapters might have been something far less serene, something more like a long conference table full of adults arguing over what counted as acceptable knowledge while drinking coffee that had been reheated too many times. You did not picture lawmakers flipping through drafts, circling sentences, or deciding which stories were too messy for the curriculum. You certainly did not imagine that the fate of entire historical episodes could hinge on whether a committee feared backlash from a handful of parents who would absolutely write very long emails. The more you revisit those lessons, the more you begin to see the fingerprints of politics tucked into the corners of your childhood pages. You remember how certain topics were given paragraphs so short you could blink and miss them, while others were granted entire spreads complete with glossy illustrations and cheerful captions. At the time, you assumed this meant some subjects were simply more important. Later, you realize importance had very little to do with it. The length of a chapter often reflected not the weight of history, but the weight of political pressure surrounding it. You start recalling the tone used in certain sections, the curious softness surrounding topics that were anything but soft. A conflict might be described as a misunderstanding. An injustice might be framed as an unfortunate moment. Entire decades of turmoil could be compressed into a handful of polite sentences that felt suspiciously careful. Those choices did not come from historians alone. They came from negotiations, compromises, and tense meetings where the goal was not accuracy, but palatability. As you learn more, you imagine the behind-the-scenes conversations that shaped what you once believed were neutral facts. You picture officials debating how to phrase a sentence so it would pass without raising eyebrows, how to summarize an era without upsetting a particular region, how to emphasize pride without brushing too close to grief. You imagine the pressure to create a version of the past that no one would object to, even if that meant smoothing over truths that refused to fit neatly into a standardized test. You begin noticing the places where those pressures left visible marks. The absence of certain voices, the overemphasis on others, the way some events were framed as triumphs even when the reality was tangled and uncomfortable. You realize that the political shaping of your textbooks was not just about what was included. It was about what was diluted, rearranged, or hidden behind the most neutral language imagination could conjure. In your memory, you see your teachers doing their best to stretch these constrained chapters into something meaningful. They added details quietly, slipped nuance into discussions, and encouraged questions, even when the text seemed allergic to complexity. They were bound to the book, yet constantly pushing at its edges, aware that the narrative in front of you was not the whole truth. Now, when you look back at those chapters, they feel less like historical accounts and more like carefully landscaped gardens, pretty, controlled, and thoroughly trimmed. You can almost sense the pruning shears behind each polished paragraph. But where the curriculum once felt complete, it now feels like an invitation to dig deeper, to discover the wild, complicated terrain hidden behind the smooth path you were originally shown. And as you follow that terrain, you begin to understand something both unsettling and clarifying. History is not just shaped by the people who lived it. It is shaped by the people who decide how it should be taught. You remember the excitement that used to bloom in your chest whenever a holiday lesson appeared on the classroom calendar, that small announcement that meant decorations, themed worksheets, and a temporary break from multiplication drills. Holidays were the bright moments of the school year, little windows of celebration tucked into the monotony of early mornings and cafeteria trays that always smelled faintly of mystery. You sat at your desk, tracing shapes onto construction paper, while your teacher explained the meaning behind each holiday, delivering stories that felt warm, tidy, and reassuring. These lessons shaped your understanding of the country as much as any textbook ever did. Back then, the stories made everything sound beautifully simple. You learned that holidays honored brave people, noble ideas, or triumphant moments when the nation came together as one smiling family. Heroes stepped forward at just the right time. History moved with comforting clarity, and the country emerged stronger, wiser, and somehow always morally centered. Every holiday seemed designed to reassure you that the past had been a steady march toward goodness. You absorbed these lessons eagerly, mostly because they came wrapped in crafts, songs, and the promise of cupcakes. You did not question why certain holidays were celebrated with grandeur, while others were mentioned with barely a whisper. You did not wonder why some stories were painted in vibrant color and others were left out entirely. To you, the holidays were simply part of the rhythm of the year, milestones that defined what mattered, what was honorable, and what the country wanted you to carry in your heart. Only later do you start to see how those holidays sculpted your sense of national identity. The stories you learned in childhood were less about historical accuracy and more about shaping loyalty, pride, and belonging. They highlighted moments of unity while leaving out the fractures beneath them. They offered heroes without flaws, victories without suffering, and meanings that had been polished until they shone with an almost ceremonial brightness. As you grow older, the simplicity begins to unravel. You learn that many holidays were created through compromises, political decisions, or cultural pressures rather than pure historical significance. You discover that some celebrations were chosen because they supported a narrative the nation wanted to emphasize, while others were erased or ignored because they complicated that narrative. You realize that each holiday you learned about was not just a celebration but a carefully selected message. You picture your childhood classroom decorated with patriotic banners and construction paper symbols, and you think about how the bright colors masked the shadows behind the stories. A holiday meant to honor unity often skimmed over the divisions that came before it. A holiday about freedom rarely acknowledged who was excluded from that freedom at the time. A holiday about progress ignored the people who had been pushed aside so that progress could happen. The celebrations were real, but the lessons were curated. You begin to reflect on how these holiday stories shaped your view of the nation itself. They taught you pride before they taught you complexity. They gave you symbols before they gave you context. They helped you feel connected, but not necessarily informed. And you realize now that national identity formed in this way is both sturdy and fragile, built on a foundation of stories that were chosen for comfort more than truth. Yet you also recognize the purpose behind it. Children need stories that feel safe before they can handle stories that feel heavy. Your teachers handed you a version of the past that was manageable, one you could carry until you were ready to see the fuller picture on your own. Now, when you revisit those holidays with a wiser eye, they feel different but not empty. You see the real history behind the symbols, the struggles behind the celebrations, the people behind the parades. The meaning becomes deeper, more textured, and far more human than the cheerful classroom versions ever allowed. You remember the way your textbooks treated historical quotes as if they had arrived pre-polished, perfectly phrased, and ready to be printed on posters found in school hallways. Each quote sat inside its own little bubble, bolded, framed, and delivered with the confidence of a person who absolutely said those exact words in that exact order while standing heroically on a balcony lit by destiny. You accepted every line without hesitation because the quotes were crisp, memorable, and conveniently short. The kind of statements that felt wise even when you did not fully understand them. They sounded like the final words of people who always knew they were changing history. Back then, You never questioned how strange it was that every historical figure spoke with the same polished eloquence. You did not wonder why they all sounded like they had attended the same dramatic speechwriting workshop. You simply believed that great minds naturally express themselves in perfectly quotable sentences, the sort that could fit comfortably on a bookmark or a motivational poster in the nurse's office. The quotes felt authoritative, like the distilled essence of entire lives, and you trusted that no one would reduce something so important to a catchy slogan. Only later do you learn that many of these famous quotes were trimmed, softened, paraphrased, or, in some cases, completely invented by someone who apparently valued dramatic flair over accuracy. You discover that real historical figures spoke in long, winding sentences with tangents, uncertainties, and the occasional awkward phrasing. They repeated themselves. They rambled. They contradicted earlier points. They sounded human. And when people went back later to carve out the quotable parts, they were shaping the past with the precision of someone editing a movie trailer. You begin to revisit those childhood quotes, reading the full speeches, letters, or diary, entries behind them, and the effect is almost jarring. A bold line printed in your textbook turns out to be the cleaned-up version of something far more complicated. A phrase you memorized for a test was actually the invention of a journalist decades later. A stirring declaration never passed the lips of the person credited, but spread anyway, because it sounded too inspiring to question. You start to realize how many of the quotes that shaped your early understanding of history were crafted after the fact, polished by biographers, teachers, and storytellers who preferred a neat message over an honest one. You picture your younger self writing these quotes in careful handwriting on a poster board, believing that you were capturing the heart of history itself. You remember the satisfaction of memorizing them, feeling wiser each time you recited a line that now turns out to be more folklore than fact. There is something strangely tender about that memory, even as you recognize that you were reciting slogans rather than truths. You start thinking about why these simplified quotes became so popular in the first place. They fit easily into lessons. They made historical figures sound decisive and unified in their beliefs, even when they were not. They created emotional anchors in stories that might otherwise feel too large or too tangled for young students to grasp. The quotes were like bright signposts along the confusing highway of the past, giving you the illusion of clarity even when real clarity was impossible. Now, when you revisit those lines with adult eyes, the magic shifts. The quotes you once memorized no longer feel like perfect truths. They feel like entry points, clues that lead to fuller stories. You appreciate the messy, unedited words behind them, the uncertainty, the frustration, the humanity. You learn that the power of a historical figure does not come from a polished line trimmed to fit into a lesson. It comes from the complexity behind their voice, the long path that led them to say anything at all. You discover something else too, something you wish you could tell your younger self. A quote does not need to be perfect to be meaningful. It does not need to be tidy to matter. Sometimes the most honest words are the ones too long for the poster, too tangled for the textbook, too human for the reenactment. And once you see the real versions, you realize the truth was richer than the slogans ever hinted. You remember the first time you saw a primary source in school, a grainy photograph or a faded excerpt printed in a small box at the edge of the page, positioned like a polite guest who had been invited but asked not to speak too loudly. Your teacher pointed to it with enthusiasm, telling you this was a real piece of the past, a glimpse into what people actually saw, wrote, or felt. You believed that if the textbook included one of these precious fragments, then surely the rest of the book was built from similar honesty. You never wondered what was missing. You never imagined that entire voices had been tucked away somewhere out of sight, edited out long before the book ever reached your desk. Back then, history felt complete simply because it was handed to you bound in a sturdy cover. You trusted that the writers had combed through every scrap of evidence and selected the truest pieces. The primary sources that appeared felt carefully chosen in a way that seemed comforting rather than selective. A short diary excerpt here, a mild political statement there, a letter written in neat, heartfelt sentences that never strayed into bitterness, fear, anger, or anything too heavy for a classroom at 9 in the morning. It felt like you were being allowed to touch the past, even though the past had been edited until it resembled a polite conversation. Only later do you discover how many of the most revealing sources never made it into your lessons. You learn that people wrote things that were not neat or inspirational at all. They expressed frustration, grief, prejudice, longing, and exhaustion. They contradicted the simplified narratives that appeared in the chapters you memorized. They described events with colors far darker than the ones in your illustrated timelines. These sources were raw, confusing, and intensely human, and because of that, they were often removed before they could complicate anything. You start thinking back to those small excerpts in your textbook, the ones chosen for their agreeable tone. You imagine the vast collection of documents behind them, the flood of letters, journals, speeches, and testimonies that told the real story. You picture textbook writers sifting through it all while sitting in rooms filled with stacks of paper and deadlines, trying to assemble a version of the past that would satisfy the state requirements and avoid triggering a landslide of concerned parent phone calls. A diary entry that showed fear might stay. A diary entry that showed rage might not. A description of injustice, if softened enough, could be included. But the blunt, painful versions often disappeared into the margins, deemed too complicated, too upsetting, or too likely to interrupt the tidy flow of the narrative. You begin noticing the absences, the silences that once felt invisible, the lack of first-hand accounts during the most tumultuous events, the way certain perspectives were reduced to footnotes, the way conflict was smoothed over by quoting only the calmest voices. You realize that the story you learned was shaped just as much by what the writers removed as by what they included. The omissions were not loud. They were careful, almost gentle, like doors quietly closing in the background while you walked through a curated exhibit. As you return to these periods of history on your own, you seek out the primary sources that never appeared in your lessons. And when you find them, they hit you with a force you were never prepared for as a child. You hear people speaking plainly about suffering that your textbook summarized in one polite sentence. You read arguments that reveal motives more tangled than anything you were taught. You witness moments where historical figures contradict the polished versions you memorized. These voices make the past feel alive in a way your school lessons never did. They introduce depth where you once saw simplicity, uncertainty where you once saw inevitability. You realize that your education was shaped by a kind of quiet protection, one that sanded away the rough edges before you were old enough to understand them. But now that you see the full picture, the missing voices begin to matter far more than the ones that were presented. They give texture to events you once saw as smooth. They give emotion to stories you once saw as distant. They restore the humanity that was lost when the uncomfortable parts were quietly set aside. You find yourself returning, again and again, to the stories you once carried with so much certainty, turning them over in your mind like familiar stones that suddenly feel different in your palm. You thought you knew their weight. You thought you knew their shape. They were smooth once, softened by repetition and childhood trust. But now, as you hold them up to a fuller light, you notice the edges that were filed down, the cracks filled with comforting varnish, the places where the truth had been trimmed into something easier to memorize between spelling tests and lunchtime. The nostalgia is still there, warm and persistent, but it no longer defines the story the way it used to. You begin rebuilding your understanding slowly, almost cautiously, as though peeling back wallpaper in an old house and discovering the layers beneath. Each step reveals something surprising. Sometimes the surprise delights you, showing a depth you were never taught. Sometimes it unsettles you, forcing you to confront parts of the past that do not align with the bright illustrations from your childhood. Yet you keep going, because the deeper you dig, the more honest the world becomes, even when it challenges the comfort you once relied on. You start noticing how nostalgia shaped your early view of history, giving everything a soft glow that made events feel less chaotic than they truly were. Your classroom had been arranged to make the past feel accessible, welcoming, and digestible. The heroes were uncomplicated. The conflicts were manageable. The timelines were orderly. Even the tragedies came with a hint of reassurance, as if hardship existed mainly to teach a gentle moral rather than to reflect the messy grief people actually lived through. You realize now that nostalgia is not just a feeling, it is a filter. It gently edits reality, replacing tangled stories with smoother ones that are easier to carry. As you move beyond that filter, the world becomes more intricate. Figures you once admired for their simplicity become far more compelling in their contradictions. Events you learned as straightforward now reveal layers of cause and consequence. Woven so tightly together, you wonder how anyone could ever separate them cleanly. You begin recognizing how social, political, and cultural forces shaped decisions that once seemed as obvious as the answers printed at the back of the workbook. History stops feeling like a series of scenes in a play and begins to feel like a living ecosystem full of interactions, collisions, and crossroads. You notice how your own thinking shifts as you embrace nuance instead of clinging to the versions you memorized as a child. You find yourself comfortable with uncertainty, no longer afraid to admit that a story might have more than one truth depending on where you stand. You become willing to examine motives rather than simply accepting labels. You start asking questions you never thought to ask, questions that lead you deeper into the places your textbooks skimmed lightly over. Curiosity becomes your guide, not nostalgia, and the result is a richer, more grounded understanding of the world you inherited. Sometimes this shift feels like loss. You miss the way history once felt safe, the way it offered clear heroes and tidy lessons. There is a sweetness to that early certainty, a simplicity that let you admire without hesitation. But then you realize something unexpected. The stories you rebuild now carry a different kind of comfort, one rooted not in softness but in honesty. When the past becomes complex, it also becomes more human. The people in it stop being symbols and become individuals whose struggles, doubts, and choices feel recognizable, even relatable. The world becomes wider, and so does your empathy. You find yourself grateful for the details you were once shielded from, grateful for the voices that were missing, grateful for the nuance that now fills the spaces nostalgia once occupied. Understanding the past no longer feels like memorizing a script. It feels like listening. It feels like piecing together a mosaic from fragments that had been hidden for far too long. And as you rebuild your understanding, you realize you are not losing the stories you grew up with. You are simply giving them room to breathe. You arrive at a place you did not expect, somewhere between the stories you grew up with and the ones you have slowly uncovered on your own. At first it feels unfamiliar, like stepping into a room you have walked past for years but never bothered to enter. Yet as you look around, you begin to sense something steady in the quiet, something that does not ask you to choose between comfort and honesty, but simply invites you to sit with both. You realize you are not abandoning the myths you once carried. You are understanding them. You begin to see how those myths were shaped with care, not just to mislead you, but to give children a framework that felt manageable. There is a strange tenderness in that, even if the results created versions of the past that were more decoration than reality. You think back to the bold illustrations, the polished quotes, the stories cropped at the edges so they fit neatly into a school schedule already packed with spelling tests and cafeteria diplomacy. Those early lessons offered you a way to see yourself in a larger story, even if the view was simplified. You can recognize that intention now without needing to cling to the illusions themselves. As you move through this understanding, the myths shift from being unquestioned truths to pieces of a much larger mosaic. You see that they were not built to deceive but to anchor, to give young minds something sturdy to hold while they learned how to sort right from wrong and past from present. There is purpose in that, even if the stories left out far more than they offered. You can acknowledge the purpose without excusing the gaps. You can appreciate the structure without ignoring the scaffolding used to build it. The more you examine them, the more you realize the myths were only ever a starting point. They opened the door. They gave you silhouettes to follow. But now, with more context, you can fill in the outlines with complexities that were always there but tucked outside the frame. You start noticing how the truth gives depth to events that once felt like cartoon panels, how real people emerge from behind the polished heroes you memorized, and how their flaws make the past feel closer, more recognizable, even strangely comforting. Not because it is easier, but because it is honest. You understand now that the truth does not flatten the myths. It expands them. It turns the founding figures from statues into people who argued, hesitated, doubted, dreamed, and often stumbled. It turns conflicts into decisions influenced by fear, ambition, and desperation, and hope. It turns inventions into long, chaotic experiments instead of light bulb moments. The truth adds detail to the stories you once knew, giving them layers that make them feel alive instead of laminated. There is a moment when you realize you are no longer trying to replace your childhood understanding. You are building on it. You are giving yourself permission to hold both the gentle versions and the complex ones, letting them speak to each other instead of competing. The past becomes neither a fairy tale nor a cautionary lecture, but a landscape, uneven and shifting, full of places you have never noticed. You find yourself wanting to explore it rather than memorize it. And in that curiosity, something settles. The myths served their purpose, but they are no longer the whole story. The truth carries a weight that feels grounding rather than heavy, and a richness that you could not have appreciated when you were still coloring worksheets with blunt crayons. You see now that understanding the past is not about choosing comfort or accuracy. It is about inviting both to sit with you, knowing each offers something the other cannot. You arrive at this new perspective gently, almost without realizing it. And once you see it, you wonder how you ever saw the world any other way.